I always think this is a little weird because this is more like small group talk rather than here I'm talking to an audience, but I'll go ahead and do that anyway because what I will say is as we go through, feel free to interact more because that's the nice part about a smaller group. So what I wanted to talk about was just what I have learned about how trustworthy and reliable God is. And the immediate thought I had when I was thinking about this series and what to say was a conversation that happened when I was in graduate school a number of years ago. So my wife and I had just been married, kind of first, second year of graduate school. We were attending a church. The church was growing and didn't have enough room, and so our Sunday school class met in the foyer. And, you'd look across the foyer and you could see through the windows into the sanctuary. You could see through them in the other windows into the parking lot, the field beyond, new people coming in, large Sunday school class because people coming in thinking, hey, join a Sunday school class. This one here in the middle of the foyer is probably a good place to start. And so you just got to meet a lot of people. And on this particular day, a fatherly fellow came up and we struck up a conversation, talked about what he was interested in, talked about what I'm interested in. And as the conversation turned to my work, I was talking about being an astrophysicist, graduate school for that, learning about this, how much I enjoyed the science and doing this. And we talked for a while. And after a while, he looked straight at me, care and concern in his voice, and he goes, well, at least you still have your faith. And I thought about that because the implications of that statement are really pretty dramatic. See, according to my new friend here, studying science inevitably and ultimately destroys Christian faith. Now, I've found a very different picture as I have investigated and looked at science. And his statement reflects a dominant narrative that's out there today. See, according to that narrative, religion, Christianity included, that deals with beliefs and emotions and kind of what you want. And science, that deals with facts and reason and logic. And if science is continually explaining all of those things that people made up religion to think and to explain, why don't we just jettison all the religion and now we can just deal with the science? We can trust the science. Well, I can tell you this. As a lifelong scientist and as a committed Christian, I have found that the evidence paints a far different picture. Rather than undermining and destroying Christian faith, as we investigate and understand how the world works, we actually find great evidence for God's faithfulness and His trustworthiness and His reliability. Now, my first exposure to that scientific support of God's trustworthiness and reliability actually came when I was in college. See, as I had gone from high school into college, I had a chance to go on a summer mission trip. And as part of that mission trip, my desire to grow in my Christianity just flourished. And so I started praying, I started witnessing, I started reading my Bible, and as I went away to college, I continued all of those habits. And in the course of the first couple of years, my studies and reading in Scripture turned to Genesis. And as I started reading through Genesis, I'm reading through the footnotes in my Bible, and my footnotes in the Bible say that these have got to be 24-hour days. And since I believe in the inerrancy and authority of Scripture, I say, if that's what the Bible says, that's what I'm going to believe. But I wrestled with that because, as I've studying in my physics classes, there's a lot of things that seem to indicate the universe is much older than that, and the earth is much older than a few thousand years. And so really, I mean, if I'm honest, I thought, well, if the Bible says this is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, science seems to say something else. Most likely explanation is that science just doesn't understand time properly, that somehow we're missing there, and that maybe instead of traversing linearly, maybe time behaves exponentially or logarithmically. And so these things that we make in measurements, it's really just an inaccurate reflection of how time works. So I thought about that for a while, and during my sophomore year of college, there was a very prominent Christian who was a science that came and spoke at Iowa State. And in his speaking at Iowa State, he was talking about how the universe is billions of years old, and the latest scientific discoveries affirm the Bible's description of the world. And I'm sitting there wrestling, how can you reconcile the universe being billions of years old with Scripture saying the universe is only thousands of years old? And I couldn't reconcile it. So I went up and asked him. Said, how does this work? And his answer was, well, when you go look at what Scripture says days there, and where it's talking about those days, that word for day, yom, has many different meanings. And some Christians take those meanings to say those are 24-hour days and the universe is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. But other Christians say, as we look at what a day is, it's actually meant to be a much longer period of time. And so rather than just take his word for it, I decided, all right, let's go to the library and do some research. So I went out, found all the Hebrew lexicons. They're all in one section of the library. Sat down on the floor and started flipping through. Okay, what does it say about yom? Found yom in there. And lo and behold, he was right. Every single lexicon showed that when you talk about yom, it means different things. It can mean the daylight portion of a day. It can mean a 24-hour day. It can mean a much longer period of time. And so what I recognized, as starting there and doing further research, what I recognized was that Bible-believing Christians who hold Scripture in high regard differ in how they look at these days of creation. So what I perceived was a conflict between science and Christianity really was just a reflection of my lack of knowledge. It wasn't that science and Christianity were in conflict. I just didn't know enough to understand what was being talked about. And so with that knowledge, that okay, the time scale of the universe isn't a problem, let's go investigate his other claims that the latest scientific discoveries are affirming the biblical description of creation. Lo and behold, I found he was right. And in retrospect, this shouldn't have surprised me, because when you read through Scripture, multiple places it talks about how God reveals himself in creation. And if God reveals himself in creation, we should expect to find it to be an accurate description. And so what does it say about creation? Well, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that the universe has a beginning. Well, Big Bang cosmology indicates that the universe began to exist. One of the more frequent descriptions of the universe is that God is stretching out the heavens. Now, I don't know so much to think that the biblical authors are thinking about the expansion of the universe, but in light of Big Bang cosmology, I find this language very provocative. And we continue reading, and you find in Jeremiah where it talks about Jeremiah is actually comparing God's trustworthiness and reliability to the reliable and dependable nature about creation. He says that if day and night stop, and if the fixed patterns of the heavens stand not, then you can doubt that I will keep my promises to the nation of Israel. That's God's pronouncement that being made through Jeremiah there. So think what that's saying. You want to know how reliable I am as God in keeping my promises? Look at the heavens. How do they behave? Day and night. It just happens all the time. Fixed patterns of the heavens. They're just reliable. You can depend on them. They're trustworthy. If we were to recast that in a little bit of scientific lingo, we might say that God's reliability is an apt metaphor, or an apt metaphor for God's reliability is the constancy of the laws of physics. What's interesting is that Einstein took that philosophical, if not even theological idea that the laws of physics ought to be constant, and said, if that's true, what would our model of the universe look like? And as he built that philosophical idea into a scientific model, that's where he developed his theories of special and general relativity. those two theories codify the idea that the laws of physics are constant. Now I can tell you this. Every single test that we have thrown at the theory of general relativity, it is passed with flying colors. We really do live in a universe governed by constant laws of physics. So these three biblical and scientific ideas that the universe began, that it's expanding, that it's governed by constant laws, that forms the foundation of Big Bang cosmology. This idea or this model that virtually all scientists accept. And if you continue to study what does God say, what does the Bible reveal about what God has done, you see that God has created this universe, formed it for life to be there. In Isaiah, it says he didn't create the earth a waste place, but he formed it to be inhabited. That this universe is designed for us to be here. And even more so, not only did God design the universe for us to be here, but God created humanity in his image. And when we go out and look, we find evidence just for that. When we look at the universe, after the first few minutes of the universe, all the universe contains is hydrogen and helium. Now, what elements do you need if you're going to have life? Question for the audience there. Got to have carbon, oxygen. Yeah, you got to have those two. Do you know where those are made? Stars, exactly. So when we go investigate how do stars make carbon and oxygen, what we find is that to make a carbon atom, you got to have this very slow reaction happen. You got to have 1, 2, 3 helium nuclei all come together to form a carbon atom. That's how it's made. And we do the calculations and say, that is far too slow for the universe to have any carbon in it. There's got to be something more going on here. And as scientists studied, what they recognized that it doesn't need to have just 3 of them come together at the same time, because when 2 helium atoms come together, or helium nuclei come together, they stick together for a little bit. They're not stable. That would cause other problems. But they come together for a little bit, which means that that provides more time for that 3rd helium nucleus to come in there and join and make carbon. That reaction means that reaction goes a lot faster. But even then, you do the calculations, and it's still just not enough. And there was a very prominent atheistic scientist who was a self-professed atheist, did some calculations and said, wait a second, I can solve this. I can figure out how we get as much carbon as the universe needs if carbon has this unusual energy level that's just above its ground state. And that would make this reaction go faster. It's kind of like pushing somebody on a swing. If you push at just the right speed, that swing goes higher and higher and higher. But if you push anything off that, it just kind of cancels out. That's what this energy level would do. So lo and behold, they went and studied carbon atoms and found that energy level is just right there, which means that helium can fuse together and form carbon. But anybody know what happened? Does anybody know what happens if you throw another helium nucleus at that? What does it make? Oxygen, exactly. So if oxygen had that same sort of energy level, do you know what would happen to all the carbon? It would become oxygen. So if you want to have a universe that has carbon and oxygen, and I haven't told you the details, but if you want to have hydrogen in there as well, which is really important, you've got to have a universe where the laws of physics allow these two helium nuclei to stick together for a little bit, and a resonant energy level in the carbon nucleus, and not a resonant energy level in the oxygen nucleus. There are these 3 kind of remarkable things that need to happen. And lo and behold, our universe is set up just exactly that way. So you know what the 4 most abundant elements are in the universe? Try and list them in order. Nope, not nitrogen. Hydrogen, helium, carbon, oxygen. Now, if you would just go look at the periodic table, the abundances should be, what you would expect from that is hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, then nitrogen, then oxygen. But it turns out our universe is structured in such a way so that carbon and oxygen are the third and fourth most abundant elements in the universe. It's like God has designed it to make the building blocks of life. And when we go look even further, we go look out at just how the earth behaves. You know, we're used to seeing a nice clear atmosphere, an abundant diversity of life on the earth, this bright sun that sits up there, land covering a large fraction of the surface of the planet, oceans that are deep blue because they're very oxygen rich. And it's very different than the early earth, because on the early earth, the sun was about 30% dimmer, which means it gives a lot less energy onto the surface of the earth. And there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, which means the oceans, instead of being blue, would have been very green with a lot of iron. And all you have are these simple, single-celled organisms that are remarkable, but very different than what we see today. And you've got an earth that's just covered in liquid water. And the atmosphere has no oxygen in it, and it's just very different than what we see. And throughout the last billions of years, all of these processes, the plate tectonic processes that build continents, and the bacteria and other organisms that change what gases are in the atmosphere, and the sun's getting brighter, and all of these things could have very easily rendered the earth completely uninhabitable. But they all work together so that over the last 4.5 billion years, the average global temperature of the earth has not changed by more than about 20 degrees Celsius, which is remarkable. You have just like the sun gets 1 or 2% brighter, you go around another planet, everything else the same, the star gets 1 or 2% brighter, and it just becomes completely hot and all the water melts, or all the water evaporates. And yet on Earth, we see this remarkable interplay of these geological and atmospheric and biological and astronomical processes that coordinate and work together to make sure that Earth remains habitable. And when we look at the very fabric of life itself, the genetic code, I do a lot of computer programming. When I do computer programming, I spend a little bit of time making sure the computer does what I want it to do. I spend a lot of time dealing with all the ways that errors can come in. People type in the wrong numbers. I get 0 when I'm dividing by something. Any sort of all of these errors, I spend a lot of time doing error management in my code. When we go look at the genetic code, its capacity to handle errors in a very noisy environment and still work right is incredible. It is literally 1 in a million in its capacity to do that, of all the possible genetic codes that are out there. So we see design even in the very fabric of life itself. And not only, so we see an incredible amount of fine-tuning and design, but when we go look at all the incredible life that's out there, even the simple single-celled bacteria to the worms and the rodents that do things in the dirt, to the majestic elk, and even when we look at Neanderthals and gorillas and everything, all of these animals and creatures are incredible. But when you ask the question, what animal seeks to understand why it's here, what's its place, and who do I worship? There's only one of those, and that's us. So we see a great deal of support as we look at this. All of these pieces of data point to a remarkable truth, that science and Christianity belong together, that the data points to God being trustworthy and reliable. Now you might think that after I'd recognized all of this, that I would have a great deal of confidence in the truth of Christianity. And on the surface, I did. I would take classes on how to be an apologist. I've taught classes on how to be an apologist. I've helped people understand what the science says and how it points to the truth of Christianity. If you'd asked me directly, I would say, of course, science and Christianity go together. Of course they do. But what I found is that as new scientific discoveries came out, I was anxious. And as those discoveries kept coming out, as we found out about there being Martian meteorites that might have evidence of life on Mars, and we find evidence that there are gullies where water is being formed on Mars, and we see evidence of liquid water on Mars, and we find the materials of the amino acids out in space, and this anxiety just grew larger and larger. At one point, I recognized that I was getting anxious, and so I said, all right, what's going on here, God? What am I doing here? What am I thinking? And in spite of all I would have said verbally, what I recognized is that I was worried that as I read these new discoveries, perhaps this discovery was going to be the one that showed that Christianity was wrong. And I was real grateful for that recognition because it gave me a chance to think rightly. See, if God is the creator of the world, and I believe that he is, and if God is the inspiration for Scripture, and I believe that he is, then that discovery that's going to show Christianity wrong will never happen. That single recognition where I decided to believe that removed every bit of anxiety I have ever felt, and I have never felt anxiety about any scientific discovery since. Doesn't mean I don't have questions. I still have lots of questions. One of my big questions that I have wrestled with is the idea that all the stuff we can see may not be all that there is. The idea of the multiverse. Scientists are entertaining this idea that we live in a multiverse. And I'm not just talking about the 9 realms kind of lining up and that you've got this mysterious ether that when you amplify it could destroy. I mean, I'm not talking Marvel. I'm talking the idea that all of the stuff of the universe that we can see and measure is not all that there is. And maybe this multiverse is just a whole bunch of stuff just like our universe, or maybe it is this unfathomably large realm of universes that all start in their own Big Bang. And if you look at inflationary Big Bang cosmology, it produces a multiverse that might remove the need for a beginning and explain all of this design evidence naturally. Yes? Yes. Yes and no. And that is a great question, and I will come back to that, and I will give you an answer to that. Hassenfelder, yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to what she's saying. I think you can establish that a multiverse exists. I don't know that you can tell very much about what it actually looks like. And I want to make that distinction because a lot of people think that scientists just made up the multiverse to get around for God. It's like, well, we can't measure this, let's just make it up, we'll have the multiverse, and that way we don't have to worry about God. It explains all the evidence. And I'm not saying there aren't scientists who latch onto the multiverse as a need to get around God. But as I've investigated this, there are really good scientific reasons to think that a multiverse exists. It's not something scientists just made up to get around God. But as I investigated the multiverse more, what I found is that as scientists research multiverse models, they found that the multiverse has a beginning. And the fact that we exist in multiverse models means that there's fine-tuning and design there. And this thing that I thought originally was a threat or that somehow undermined the arguments for God's existence actually made the arguments for God's existence more robust and reliable. God truly is trustworthy and reliable. One other question I had: what happens if we find life somewhere else? There are billions of planets in the Milky Way alone. as we're looking, what happens if we find life? And I'm not just, whether we find bacterial life or whether we find sentient life, what happens if we do that? Wouldn't the discovery of life confirm that naturalism is correct and Christianity is wrong? So let's go out and start researching. What can I find out about this? Find out that Christians have thought about this topic for centuries, if not millennia. Science is the new player in the game. Christians have thought about this for a long time. And when science did finally get into the game, you know what science has shown us? Science has shown us that for life to exist, there's an incredible amount of design and fine-tuning that must happen. And if that fine-tuning and design must happen for us to be here, that fine-tuning and design must also happen for any other life that we find. This question of whether there's life out there is not, is Christianity or naturalism correct? This question is, did God choose to create life only here, or did God choose to create life other places as well? Whether we're the only life in the universe or not is not the really incredible question. It's really, what did God do? And again, Christians have been thinking about this for centuries and millennia. Science is kind of late to the game in the discussion. What I've found in investigating and wrestling through these topics is that these areas which I thought were a threat to Christianity turned out to actually provide great evidence for God's trustworthy and reliability. And I grew far more confident in the truth of Christianity. Now, there is one, I actually wrote books on that. One's called Who's Afraid of the Multiverse? One's called Is There Life Out There? I did another book where I looked at what happens if the universe doesn't have a beginning. The reason why I wrote these, one, these are just questions that I had. Why I encourage other people to read them is that you get to enjoy what I've learned in the discovery process. That as you investigate these things that maybe if they show up this way, Christianity's wrong, you'll find that the evidence really points to what Christianity said all along. And it has given me great confidence in the truth of Christianity. Now, there is one more lesson that I've learned. And to illustrate that lesson, I need to give you a little bit more of my story. See, one of my first memories was sitting at the top of the stairs in my duplex, looking downstairs at my dad, giving a chemistry display to a group that my older brother was involved with. That's not this picture. This picture happened a little later. But this is the same sort of demonstration my dad would give. He would take balls, dip them in liquid nitrogen, throw them on the wall, they'd shatter. He would take chemicals, pour them together, get weird noises, cool smells, odd shapes. What I've come to appreciate in seeing those and doing many of those demonstrations myself is that what looks like magic, we can explain and wow people with. One of the other memories I have of my parents is seeing them being baptized in the 102 River outside St. Joseph, Missouri. Their Christianity permeated our home. We regularly attended church, served others, read the Bible, learned how to pray. As they taught me Christianity, when I was in the 5th grade in Awana, I trusted Christ as my Savior and Lord. I recognized during the council time that God loved me, that I was separated from God, that Christ died on the cross to pay for my sins so that I can be reconciled if I would accept Christ's gift. And so I did. Now, I didn't, as the council time message gave, go tell my leader about it, because I really don't like talking to people. You'd never know that. But I did go home and talk to my parents about it that night. And my parents asked me, and I've gone back and asked, and I genuinely understood what was going on there, and that's where I started my journey with Christ. The lesson I learned actually takes place in the context of an event that happened years later. My dad and brothers and I, while I was in college, started a family guide tradition right around the end of the school year. We'd go on a fishing trip. We'd go down to southern Missouri, rent a boat, go out on the lake. We'd canoe down a river, just looking forward to catching fish. We all like to fish. And as we grew, the fishing trip grew. And in this particular year, we were headed down to the Gulf of Mexico. Except, I couldn't go. My dad had scheduled the trip in May. My wife was due to deliver in April, and she was having preterm labor problems. I'm like, nope, can't do that. As much as I want to go, I just can't do that. Now, I had this problem with this, though, because this is here the most important person in my life, scheduling an important family tradition that I'm supposed to be a part of, and he's doing it where I can't be there. I was just angry at my dad. How could he do this to me? How could he do this and truly love me? That was the question I was wrestling with. And worse than that, the trip put me in a bind because I knew it was about a week or about a month until the trip was going to happen, and I knew I needed to be able to talk with them about it. And I'm mad at them, so I don't want to do that. In fact, I sat there and thought maybe it's easier just to limit my relationship, or maybe even just sever it. That didn't entertain that thought too long, but that's the kind of thing I'm thinking right there. And so finally I just say, all right, God, what's going on here? How do I deal with this? And as I'm sitting there and thinking about this, God prompted me to dwell on the truth. See, this dad who scheduled this trip that I can't be a part of is the same dad who, when I was younger and would be out playing soccer or some other sport, he would take time out of his very busy schedule to be my coach, especially when I had bad coaches and things weren't going well. He would step in and make sure that things were going to go all right. Same dad who taught me how to play Lego, taught me how to play chess, let me win at chess so that I got confident in playing at chess, would regularly attend all my football games. And in fact, there was one football game that stands out to me because this particular game, my dad was a chemistry professor at the local college, and he'd won a Teacher of the Year award. And I found out from my mom that my dad was going to miss his Teacher of the Year award ceremony because it coincided with my football game. And I was really grateful for my mom for letting me know that because I was able to go to my dad and say, no, please go to your ceremony. But that sacrifice that he was willing to make showed me that, yes, my dad loved me. He was willing to sacrifice of himself to provide and care for and love me. And I received that message very loud and clear. And so as I'm thinking and dwelling on all of these things and thinking about the trip, I had a choice. I could either choose to focus on the hurt and the pain and the resentment, or I could choose to focus on the truth that my dad loved me. I can tell you this, as I chose to focus on the truth that my dad loved me, nothing about my circumstances changed. I missed the trip, didn't get to go, didn't even get an explanation for many, 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 many years later. But as I chose to focus on the truth, my anger and resentment began to melt away. And I can tell you this, as I have interacted with my dad, and in fact, in spite of situations, actually, that's not true. Because of situations like this, as I continue to interact and trust that my dad loves me, my relationship with him grows stronger and stronger and stronger each year. It's important to choose to believe the truth. So, there's a lot of scientific evidence pointing toward the truth of creation, who God is, God's trustworthy and reliableness. What do you do when someone, either you or someone you know, is wrestling with doubt? As I've thought about it, Jesus gives a great example of how to deal with doubt in Matthew 11. Read there, John the Baptist, he's in prison. He sends his disciples to Jesus with this one question: are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? Think about that question for a second. Is there a more ludicrous question in the world? I mean, think who John is. John, while in the womb, recognized the presence of the Messiah. John's sole purpose in life was to prepare the way for the Messiah. John baptized Jesus. As Jesus comes up out of the water, the heavens open, the dove ascends, alights on his shoulder, and there's this voice: "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." if there's one person in the world who ought to know who Jesus is, it's John. What's Jesus' response? See, Jesus welcomed the honest question. He didn't say, oh, come on, John. He didn't say, come on, John, you just got to have faith. No, what did Jesus do? He didn't give him a data dump. He didn't ridicule him. He didn't say everything that might convince him is the Messiah. His response was simple. Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. See, he sent John's disciples back with the answer to the question that addressed John's need to know the truth, and then he left John to decide whether he would choose to believe it or not. See, many people think that, don't always do a good job advancing my slides, sorry about that. Many people think that studying science will ultimately undermine the truth of Christianity. But the evidence really does just paint a different picture. As we understand more about this world, we see stronger and stronger evidence that God is trustworthy and reliable. And not only, as we wrestle with those questions and wrestle through those doubts, does our confidence in the truth of Christianity grow. Not just in the things that we can go out and measure scientifically, but our confidence in the truth of Christianity, that God is trustworthy in anything in which our life depends, even our eternal destiny. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Great. We'll see you next week. No, no. Any thought or any questions that come up? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Like the day could be a different period of time. But I was just wondering how you would reconcile that with Genesis 1 when it talks about evening came in the morning and that was one day. Because it says evening and morning, so that would lean towards an actual day that we experience. Would it be that the days have been longer or something like that? Or?
Well, so not a Hebrew scholar, but in my investigation of that, a couple of things that I have learned. In the same way that Yom has multiple meanings, those words for evening and morning have also similar, sometimes even parallel meanings, because if day means a 24-hour day, then yes, morning and evening have a very literal definition that matches with them, or concrete definition that matches with them. But if day means like a period of time, then the evening and the morning is kind of like the dawning and the dusk, not dusking. Dusking is not a word. What's the end of the day? Morning and evening. So it has that parallel kind of structure to it as well. So in the same way Yom has those meanings, the words for morning and evening have those meanings. And one of the things as a non-Hebrew scholar that has caused me to give pause when I'm saying, okay, what are the meanings here, and to recognize some of the limitations, is that if you go look at your Strong's Theological Concordance for the Old Testament, you will find that there are, in the Old Testament, 8,000 words. It's 8,000 something. I forget what the something is, but just over 8,000 words. Most of those, about 5,000, are proper names. So you take out all the proper names, the entirety of the Old Testament is written with 3,000 words. Now, compare that with the English language. I don't know what the average vocabulary is, but I know the English language has millions of words. Now, if you're contrasting millions of words in a language with thousands of words, what does that tell you about the structure of those two languages? When you want to communicate different meanings, what do you do in English? Different word. When you want to communicate different meanings in Hebrew language, what do you do? Same word, different context. So you go back and you look at how the words are used in Genesis 1. They are not used the same way throughout Scripture. To me, that's a sign, at least. It's not a proof or anything, but it's a sign. Those days are not normal days somehow. That's not here's the answer, but those are things that are informative to me. So, yes?
I wonder if you could answer his question by referring to Gerald Schroeder is a pretty
Mm-hmm.
influential Hebrew scholar, but he's also trained at MIT.
Right.
And he believes that there's really two calendars in the Bible. There's the days of creation,
Mm-hmm.
and he believes that there's also the calendar that starts with Adam. I guess the day that Adam, had the Spirit put into him.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's a summary of what he says. Do you have any? You know about it, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So as I actually had Gerald Schroeder gave a talk over at APU, and I happened to be able. I just went to his talk, and I had a little chance to talk with him afterwards because I was just trying to understand what is it that you're trying to say here, and my recollection of what he said is that we're looking back at creation, and so we're saying day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. How does that play out? We're seeing scientifically, we're seeing billions of years. That creation in Gerald Schroeder's model is God is revealing creation day 1, day 2, day 3. But what you have is, because God's looking forward, as the universe is expanding, our measure of time and God's measure of time are not the same. And so what is 6 days in God's measure looking forward is billions of years in our looking back. It's not entirely dissimilar from my thought that, okay, if the universe looks to be billions of years old, and the earth billions of years old, and humanity thousands of years old, but yet those are 24-hour days, that time behaves logarithmically or exponentially. It's akin to that, but it's a little bit different mechanism that produces it.
At a certain point of thinking about this, and he basically used the theory of relativity, because light, as it existed at the very beginning of let there be light, that light now exists as the microwave radiation.
Right.
And he calculated, given the expansion of the universe and the fact that the light has changed wavelength, he calculated how many days does that correspond to, and he came up with 5.5 days. And he was quite impressed with that calculation.
Yes, but that's in the context of what I was describing there. So it's calculations that play into that picture. Yeah.
He had this concept, and then he calculated it out,
Mm-hmm.
and he came up with 5.5, which is pretty close to 6 days
Fair point.
of creation. And,
I think Schroeder's idea is interesting. I think my perspective is it's wrong because it misses on a couple of counts in my assessment. This is interesting discussion that, not like I've proven him wrong, but I think one of the things that's true is that in his description now, let there be light is this weird electromagnetic phenomena that nobody throughout the history of creation until the last 100 years would ever understand what it means. As opposed to, in my explanation, let there be light is the light from the sun is penetrating through the clouds and getting down to the previously dark surface of the earth. So in his model, light is a very different phenomena for the bulk of human history in what's being described than most of the phenomenological language we see throughout Scripture. And so there's just differences in what the various creation miracles are that I think are better explained in our model than in his. But I don't think it's right, but I think it's a discussion that belongs on the table of ideas for Christians to talk about. So. Okay.
it really did help me a lot.
Very good.
And,
I know it has for many Christians. So.
and that 5.5 days calculation was part of it. Really
Gotcha.
made it more effective.
Yes.
Okay, you said near the beginning that there's like a normal range of climate change, you probably know where I'm going, of about 20 degrees Celsius.
Well, so what I said is that on the Earth, despite all of these huge changes, our climate has not gone hot, or it stayed within a 20 degrees Celsius window the whole time, right around where liquid water exists.
Meaning like across locations or across time? Like, I mean, because obviously there are ice ages,
Yes.
there are times of warming, so that's what you're referring to with the 20
Sometimes it's colder and you're in an ice age. Sometimes all the ice is frozen and you're in hot. But even in all of those, we've been within that 20 degrees Celsius window.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So there's a lot of hysteria about climate change right now. Are we still in that 20-degree band? Or have we, have we gone out of this?
No, that's a good question. So just for scale, we're talking about changes in global temperature at this point of 0 to 3 degrees Celsius. So we've increased by a half a degree. In the worst kind of extreme cases, it would increase by 1 to 3 degrees over the next 100 to 200 years. So well within that 20 degree C window.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that 1 or 2 or 3 degrees Celsius wouldn't have pretty dramatic consequences in how the Earth looks.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So we can't assume that all the climate change is being caused by, us just polluting the world, or there's probably some balance between just natural cycles of climate and the effect of humans, on the world.
There really is, yes.
Do we know? I guess that's probably pretty controversial on what's more at fault.
Well, what I would say is I've kind of thought about this for 10-ish years or so, and what I recognize is that it may have changed. I don't think it has. My experience is most people think about climate change politically. And what I mean by that is that if you tell me your political persuasion, I can probably tell you what your position is on climate change. I did a highly scientific study of one Sunday school class where I had everybody line up and said, all right, line up here, global warming's a hoax, global warming is going to destroy the Earth. Line up on there. Now I say, all right, we're going to change this, and this is diehard conservative, bleeding heart liberal. I didn't use pejorative terms. I forgot the term. About 2 people in the middle switch. That's the only thing that changed. So these are pretty mature Christians in my assessment. And so it just kind of illustrates the point that most people are thinking about this politically. My encouragement is, as Christians, let's think about things theologically. What do we know? God has created the universe, designed it, fashioned Earth, fashioned us. The idea that we can destroy what God has created is a little bit arrogant. In fact, it's a little bit blasphemous in some sense. The flip side of that is, first thing God said to Adam and Eve. Actually, God said to Adam, and then Adam communicated to Eve later. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, rule over it, subdue it. So yes, I've created it, take care of it. We don't get to say, well, we can do whatever, God's going to take care of it. That's the error on this side, the conservative side tends to be that. We also don't get to say, we're going to destroy it, which is this side. And I love the way Hugh has made the comment. He goes, if God has created things, the solutions out there for this are going to be the ones where we take care of humanity and the earth at the same time. And generally, like I said, we're thinking politically, not theologically. And even when we do now need to move over and deal with, okay, what do we do? Let's not think politically, let's think scientifically. And in scientifically, I see there are 4 questions to think about. 1, is the globe warming? 2, what role do humans play? 3, how big a deal is it? 4, what do we do about it? Okay, is the globe warming? Yes, the data is unequivocal about that. What role do humans play? Last time I went and asked somebody who I could trust, it was somewhere between 20 and 80%. So all that says is humans are involved. We're not the only cause, though. And so there's still, what does it mean? It may be we know more. We can narrow the range. I don't know the answer to that. But we're involved, so we do play a role. We're not the only things involved. How big a deal is it? I'm not sure we actually know the answer to that question yet. Because in some measure, if we don't ask how big a deal it is, we don't get the right answer of what do we do about it. Because one of the answers may be, let's curtail human activity so that the climate... I think we need to do some of that, But commensurate with that, we also just have to realize we need to adapt to it. There's a whole, I'll give a place where we don't actually consider that answer, is that we've spent a lot of effort building infrastructure right on the ocean coast, where the consequences of global warming are going to be more dramatic. Should we not be more interested in making sure, well, hey, the sea levels are going to rise, how do we adjust and adapt to that, as opposed to make sure it doesn't happen? Now, the flip side of that is there are islands who are going to disappear. And so there's a more complex question to that. I'm not claiming that or the other, but if you look at the answers that are out there, most of them are, we don't have to worry too much about it, it's all a hoax, or we need to severely curtail human activity. And none of those are, okay, what's good for the planet and for humanity? And quite honestly, there are some much easier solutions that don't deal with carbon dioxide, but deal with methane and soot and other things that not only help the planet, but also help humanity far more. And we don't seem to be talking a lot about those. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about the adaptability. What are we going to do to adapt to it? So that's a long answer to a very complicated question.
I believe there is one more question,
What's that?
which is, my impression of what God is like is that if there is a real problem, He will provide a solution.
Absolutely.
And I think the solution would then be something that would increase our faith in God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another question. And I've been asking myself, what is that solution? So,
Yeah. The moment we quit thinking politically about it, the more likely we are to deal with that. I mean, I'm going to make what sounds very political statement, but it's actually an anti-political statement. If Al Gore really thought climate change was a problem, he shouldn't have made it a political issue. Because now you've got the my side, your side problem with it. If it's really a problem, you want everybody involved in finding the solutions. And it immediately divided people. And as Christians, we went along with the division, which bugs the daylights out of me. So,
gas-consuming private planes, you should be taking.
well, there's a whole lot of other discussion, and I'm going to quit and avoid those right now. So,
Yeah, this is good. So I'm curious in your experience and your organization's experience with sharing this kind of info with people that are science-minded or looking for proof more on the creation side. Is that more of an intro, and what's your approach at getting towards like the need for a savior, Jesus, sin, more of a personal relationship stuff? It's more existential questions,
yes,
salvation.
absolutely. No, it's all over the map. There are people who just don't know, they've never been taught, never heard that science and Christianity work well together, because there's this pretty dominant narrative that science and Christianity are in conflict. It's been around for 100 years. It's thoroughly discredited academically, the idea that science and Christianity are in conflict, but yet nonetheless it persists. It's kind of morphed more recently into religion is belief and emotions and science. That's a different discussion. So it kind of depends on what the issue and hang-up is. And, if I could point to an example of one of the things that has impressed me about how Jesus interacted with people is that he didn't have a strategy for interacting with them as much as I want to know who you are and I want to deal with your issue. And I don't know how to do that except relationally and trusting that God will give you the input. So I do think there are general principles at play there. I think there are people who don't know that Christianity aligns. I think there are people who are just outright antagonistic towards Christianity. I think there are people who want Christianity to believe but just don't think it can work. I think people who just apathetic and don't care, or so engaged in other things they just don't want to. And my strategy, if you will, is how can I talk with you so that we're in a relationship so I see where God's at work in you? And then how can I help that? How can I be a part of that? That requires me knowing, I've had to build a lot of apologetic tools so that I can be equipped to do that. But even more importantly, I think just being able to interact with people is really important. I can't tell you how many conversations where I get to present the gospel where I've never actually said anything but ask questions. Because people like to talk about themselves. And if you can talk, then you're seeing what's going on and you're caring about them and you're engaging and I'm able in my doing that helps me figure out what are you doing here, God, and how can I be a part of what you're doing? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was coming at it I like science, and as when I was a younger believer, that kind of drew me in, confirmation, and I know there's a lot more evidence, and that increases with research, but people still have to have a personal reckoning. Okay, I need a savior. That's more of a faith thing. I mean, you have to kind of shift from, okay, there's enough proof or evidence there. Now I got to have a personal relationship with God, or why do I need Jesus? What's the cross about? Those are almost they can be related, but in some ways they're different. There's a faith component that you have to shift towards from the science part.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do think I can't say that every Christian needs to be out there, here's all the science you need to know. Because if I applied that same logic, here's everything I need to know about Islam. Here's everything I need to know about the arts, or there's just too much information like that to know. But what every Christian needs to know is we don't need to be good scientists in that you know all the science, but we do need to be really good theologians. And most of the time, when you're talking, eventually what you're identifying is a place where somebody's got a wrong theology of who God is. And now I can say, hey, science shows that God is reliable or trustworthy or cares or is powerful or whatever. But it's getting to that issue of who do you think God is, and how can I help you see more clearly who he is and how much love he has for you through his sending his son to die on the cross for you. So it's a theological question where I use science to have the discussion. Yes? I'll go back here first, yeah.
What you just said right there is having the understanding of who God really is, I had a conversation today with an individual where I feel like his intellect is way beyond mine, but we were discussing things, and I was trying to explain some of the simplicities and some of the things of the characteristics of God and who he is. And he eventually, even though you can tell he really wants to grab hold of it, and he really wants to have a foundation that he can hold on to that. But eventually, he always kind of slides off to. And it's funny, like you just mentioned, multiverses. We will get into that conversation. What about? And I don't want to make it simple, like you just mentioned that my way or the highway. I was explaining to him that, but there's some things what God says and how he explains himself, like you just mentioned, how he presented himself to people, and he said how he cared about what they felt, who they were, and he met them right where they were at.
Right.
And when we kind of diverse from that and got onto that, he loved that.
Yeah.
And it met the needs that he needed, because in a sense there's kind of like an emptiness, but he wants something.
Right.
So,
I appreciate you sharing. Thanks. Yes.
Going back to the global warming thing, to your point number 4, what can be done about it?
Right.
I hear some talk about those that are scared we're all going to die. They're going to do something to the ozone level, spray something that cuts off the sun rays and stuff like that. Is that just a blip on the screen, or could that cause some damage to our?
I think it's a blip on the screen.
Well, so the idea behind that is if the globe is warming, you ask what factors contribute to that. And the dominant factor to the global temperature is the sun and how much radiation it gives off. Now, once it leaves the sun, it travels through space unimpeded, outside of decreasing by 1/r². But once it gets to the Earth, on the surface or on the top of the atmosphere, it gets transmitted to the surface of the Earth, heats up the Earth, re-radiated, what was visible now becomes re-radiated in infrared, and if you've got greenhouse gases, as that thermal radiation comes up, it gets absorbed and some of it goes out and some of it goes back, and so it actually heats the planet up. If that didn't happen, the global temperature of the Earth would be about 15 degrees Celsius below zero. So global warming is a great thing. It heats the planet up about 33 degrees, makes it a habitable place. Now, our question in dealing with global warming, the human concern part of it, is are we putting more greenhouse gases so that the planet is heating up even more? One thought is maybe that's going on. It's going to take a long time to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What if we were to reduce the amount of solar radiation that got to the surface of the Earth? And there are things you could sprinkle in the atmosphere that would reflect more of the light off to space. So even though the greenhouse gases go up, we can mediate how much is getting to the Earth, and that might keep the temperature in range. Now, you raise a great question. Might there be other consequences to that? If you're doing this on a large enough scale to impact the global temperature, you may very well be impacting other things. And I don't know how you actually know that before you do it. And so we just need to be careful. I think it's a great thing to pursue and study, but we need to make sure we know what we're doing before we try that. Because you could, well, you could in principle get data to figure that out, but there's a lot that you need to know. You need to have a pretty comprehensive understanding rather than a general understanding.
Would you say, I think there's a lack of kind of a holistic approach to everything. I think there's too much division in science for people to just step back and kind of take everything in. Like trees and plant life, they grow larger when the CO2 levels are higher. I've heard about this. And you'll get more food supply, more lush atmosphere. But then they're like, oh, we can't burn coal, let's do biomass plants where we burn all wood and trees and everything. So they're doing that, and then that's kind of counterproductive to wanting to lower the CO2 levels. And then in California, they want everybody to have desertscape. Well, your grass and everything, they help regulate the CO2 levels. So if you step back and here's a guy studying energy, here's an arborist, and here's a scientist studying CO2 levels and everything, is there a lack of somebody to just sit there and look at it and go, well, everything's kind of broken. We do this and this and this. Why are we creating more problems by trying to alleviate others? If the thing is a faith in God. People don't have faith that things will rectify themselves, but in the design and the structure, the trees are designed a certain way. Now, there's a company in San Francisco trying to hijack that. They're saying, oh, we're going to genetically engineer trees and plants to grow bigger in high CO2 atmospheres. Well, they already do that. So are they just enhancing it, or are they just trying to take credit for it?
Well, you've identified a problem in that there's, in the public arena, I think what happens in the scientific journals is far more balanced and addresses that more than most people are aware. I mean, there's still odd things that happen in there, but there's a lot more, let's discuss the entirety of the issue rather than focus on a single issue. Much more so than plays out in the public realm. And I see that repeatedly. And one of the examples is when you talk about global warming, what does everybody think? Oh, carbon dioxide, right? That's not the only greenhouse gas up there. There's methane, there's other ones up there. And what we also doesn't happen out in the public arena is, a very important recognition you brought up, is that the higher the CO2, the more things grow well. Plants need CO2 to grow. I was talking to a petroleum geologist that I know, and he pointed out to me, and I didn't recognize this, that during the last ice age, Earth was precipitously close to having too little carbon dioxide that the plant ecosystem would have shut down, which as you might guess, has pretty dramatic consequences for life on Earth, because everything depends on the plant. So I think this is a place where, as Christians, we can bring a biblical mindset into thinking about this. And that let's think about the entire picture, not get focused on any individual, or not get so focused on the individual part that we like or understand or think that we miss the bigger picture. And that's going to help across the board. I'm going to make a statement that, again, it's going to sound very political and divisive, and it's not, because it's making just the point you're making. When we talked about COVID, we were entirely focused on how many people are going to die because they have COVID. And we didn't think, how did our policies impact the relationships people are going to have, or the people who were in nursing homes, or. And I have relatives who, because of the isolation, before COVID, they were able to take care of themselves. Now they've got advanced Alzheimer's. And so it's just like when we focus on the little piece and use it for whatever gain, we miss that these are just complicated issues. And so let's not get stuck in there, and let's not think politically, let's think bigger. Let's think theologically about it. And again, that's not a statement on COVID. It was a statement on how, as a society, we approached COVID, that we got entirely focused, and every group tended to have their own focus, and they were different, but we weren't thinking holistically. And these are pretty complex systems, and humans are pretty complex people, and this entire ecosystem is pretty complex. It's very robust, but it's also very complex. So let's think what we do.
All these different journals from everybody else, he was able to see the big picture of things instead of, because he was what did he do? Did he interpret, or?
No, he was a patent clerk.
Patent clerk, yeah, so he
Got to read a lot of stuff.
And
What I would say is, because he read a lot of stuff, he made contributions in a lot of places. The piece of information he needed that ultimately led to general relativity was relatively common knowledge. It required actually a pretty basic level of physics to get. He's just the one who thought, hey, there might be a way to solve this. But I agree with your point in general. There are some details that are missed there. So, yes?
What do you think about the anthropic principle, or like, if you're an astrophysicist, like how alone we are in the universe or multiverse? Like, it seems.
So how would you define the anthropic principle? Because that's
the fine-tuning or precision of the Earth and distance from sun, all the factors that make for life, position, even I hear position in the galaxy, type of galaxy, composition of the elements in the atmosphere, all that's very, very much points to a creator design, but you don't get any signals from SETI or other projects, or there's kind of low evidence, or what do they call it, the Fermi paradox, but like how well, I don't even know, of all the exoplanets they found, if they're looking for like a holistic anthropic signature of everything there, or they just, this looks pretty close to an Earth that could have water. Do we know all the factors where something would be, sustain life, or it looks like it's...
So I'll throw a few thoughts related to your question, because there's like 12 questions in there. But one, I will say this, in terms of looking for planets outside our solar system, we don't have the capacity to detect our solar system yet. So we're finding the stuff that all looks different. We find the very large planets, the ones that are close in, the ones that are around smaller stars. Finding our solar system is really hard. We can't do that yet. We're right at the boundary of being able to do it. So in that sense, to the extent a livable solar system or a livable planetary system has to look like our solar system, we're not in that, but we can't do that consistently yet. But what I would say is this, and the way I've heard that fine-tuning articulated, I've changed the way I thought about it because of my investigation into is there life out there. is that the way I thought about it, it's like there are so many parameters, so many of them need to be fine-tuned. There's only one place in the entire universe where we expect them all to come together, and that's why we're the only life in the universe. But I think that misses the point. Because you also, if God had not done this, it wouldn't work. So what I would say is, in order for life to exist, you need to have this incredible fine-tuning. The universe needs to be a certain way. You need to have the right kind of place where it all works out. And apart from God's intervention, it's not going to happen. But that raises the question, is this the only place God did that? Might he have done it somewhere else? I don't have an answer to that. Scientifically, we don't know. Theologically, we don't know. And Christians have had this debate for centuries. Galileo thought God only created life here on earth. Devout Christian, Bible-believing Christian, God only created life here on earth. Kepler, his contemporary, Bible-believing, devout Christian, thought God created life on all the things that we can see. Christians have been arguing about that. I think Adam and Eve were arguing about whether we're the only life in the universe or not. So it's just that interesting of a question. But what I will say, there is no doubt that the amount of fine-tuning and the design that needs to happen is incredible, or else you won't get life. But to me, that raises the theological question that science can now help us investigate. But it's not primarily a scientific question, in my assessment.
Yeah, and then seems like people think that advancing in space exploration is necessary, being a multi-planet civilization. Coming from a non-faith-based perspective, maybe that's on us to preserve humanity and not trusting that God will intervene.
Well, if you're going to preserve humanity, I can guarantee the Earth is not going to be habitable in a while. Now, what a while means is 500 million years, maybe 500 or 100 million years. I can count numerous scenarios where the Earth is going to be uninhabitable. Even if all of these are wrong, at some point in time, the sun's going to swell up to where its radius is the size of Earth's orbit. Now, Earth will have moved out a little further, so it won't get consumed, but that's not going to be a very healthy place to live. It's going to be impossible to live. But if all you have is this universe, then yeah, our only option is to move somewhere, because that's the only way you're going to be sustainable. I will say this, regardless of your theological persuasion, moving through space is harder than I'll get out. I may well be impossible. And I have a chapter that addresses the challenges of moving through space in my book, Is There Life Out There, if you really want to know more. So.
I'm just saying that there seems like to be the perspective that it's on us to do that versus God having to care for us, or taking care of us, or returning, or preventing cataclysm. I'm not opposed to space exploration, but it seems like it's.
I think you'll find that Christians have a fairly varied position on that as well. If your naturalism, Earth, the physical is all there is, you don't have any option but to move somewhere else, or humanity is going to be extinguished. As Christians, there are Christians who think we need to do stuff like that too. So I think it's not just a naturalist position.
Isn't our magnetosphere our protection against the sun? So if something, maybe the sun gets a little close, maybe that magnetosphere will adjust in such a way where we're more protected. It's easy to say, if this happens in this current state and this current time, we're dead.
Mm-hmm.
But there's things in place that help balance things out. Even you look back in time, the solar radiation was different back then than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
Are we taking that concept when we carbon date things? Are we taking the current levels, or are we able to sit there and look at it and go, well, it might have been different back then. We don't know exactly what was going on, or maybe we do, but it's a different time. So to me, it's hard to have that assumption with everything if we don't know the circumstances of the past exactly. We can sit there and speculate, but we don't know exactly what those circumstances were back then. And
No, you're identifying a very real problem, and there's always the what do we know, and we know a lot more than most people are aware of. These sorts of discussions happen in the scientific literature. So you go, you talked about carbon dating. Scientists are aware that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has changed over time because the strength of the magnetic field of the Earth affects that. There's other things that affect that, and so they have worked very hard to say, okay, how do we measure and account for all that? And they can measure and account for all that back to probably, I think it's like 15 to 20,000 years, pretty well. There's ways to calibrate that entire and measure all of those consequences. But that doesn't, but now you go and you say, all right, well, what happens to the Earth's temperature if this happens? This is a pretty complex system, and you're always asking the question, what actually weighs into that? And so we always want to know more than we do, but you have to make do with what you know now and recognize the limitations of what you know. And most scientists are generally pretty good at that. When you start talking publicly, that gets mixed and lost a lot of times.
Let's say the pole shift or something like that, is that the way the Earth adjusts to what's going on, maybe with the sun or other things, that's the way to kind of preserve it, even though it wipes out a lot of life and changes the climate everywhere. Wouldn't that be a way to make some sort of adjustment?
So, there are, in that scientific discussion, you ask, okay, what goes on with the sun? Does that affect the magnetic field of the Earth? And the answer, where the poles shift and everything, the answer to that's no. Because what determines the magnetic field of the Earth is stuff inside the interior, or in the interior of the Earth. But what we've seen often, and I'll give you an example, sun's luminosity increasing dramatically over the course of Earth, from 30% dimmer to its current. That's a huge change. Most of the time, Earth's atmosphere had no oxygen in it. Up until about 2.5 billion years ago, there was no oxygen, no free oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, when organisms came around that started producing oxygen, it had to fill up a whole bunch of things, but eventually started putting it into the atmosphere. You know what oxygen does when it comes in contact with methane is that it breaks down the methane, makes carbon dioxide and water. So when Earth's organisms started producing a lot of oxygen, it changed the greenhouse effect on the globe, and probably caused the Earth to go into a global ice ball where it just almost froze the entire Earth over. Now, right at that time, there's this period where a supercontinent is breaking up, which generates a lot of tectonic activity, which puts a whole bunch of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, those two things are unrelated in that one doesn't cause the other. But they coincided in time enough so that as the Earth's oxygen content in the atmosphere is starting to come into place, there's tectonic activity that offsets the global cooling from the oxygen. The tectonic activity heats the Earth up, and so you get an ice ball for a little while, but it comes out of it pretty quickly. And so they're two unrelated processes that happen to coincide to keep Earth inside that 20 degrees C window. Whether that happens with what's going on with the sun and the magnetic field of the Earth, it might. We've seen instances of that before. Those are things beyond our control, and so they really are in God's hands. There's nothing we can do about them. So, question here.
What Jeremy was saying made me think of something. Do you think when God created the universe and especially the Earth and our solar system, He put in place some sort of like self-healing, self-balancing type mechanisms? I think about like the human immune system.
Mm-hmm.
To a great extent, our bodies are made to fight against things that don't belong there.
Mm-hmm.
But the solar system or the Earth or the universe, whatever scale you want to look at, does that have kind of an immune system as well?
I wouldn't use that terminology, but yes, we see as we look. I don't know that you see it out in the universe. I'd have to think more about that. But I do know that on the Earth, there are things that act as regulators. One of those being water. I mean, the fact that Earth has a huge water surface to it, as things get hotter, that puts more clouds in the atmosphere. Clouds reflect more light, tends to cool the surface off. As Earth gets colder, there's a kind of a similar, there's positive or negative feedbacks, whereas you go one, what ends up happening is as it gets colder, you end up, what's the process that goes on there? Give me just a second to think through it. It's the water cycle and the tectonic cycle work together as a great global thermostat. And so as long as those two are both running, that's part of what has kept the Earth in that 20 degrees C window. So I would consider that kind of a immune system type thing, if you will. So we do see things like that. Our bodies are incredibly good at that. I would say, when I talked about the error correction in the genetic code, that's a kind of immune system, if you will. So it does seem like God's put a number of those things. Nobody has ever asked me that question. And that gives me some thoughts to think about. So I appreciate that question a lot.
I've got a similar follow-up question about that 20 degrees Celsius window. So you're saying that so right now we would be 0 to 3 degrees off of optimal, right? So
I think if there's a 20 degree C window, where we are now is like a little bit above zero. If it's plus 10, minus 10, we'll say that. We're somewhere between 0 and 5, if I remember correctly. So it's gotten closer to 15 degrees colder, but it's not gotten more than about 5 to 10 degrees hotter.
so 5 to 10 degrees hotter. So you hear a lot about ice ages, but what is the peak of temperatures of the Earth in the past, and what end has it been prior to industrialization and stuff like that? I'm guessing it was probably right after the ice ages, right?
It has been hotter in the past. We've got records. I mean, there's places we can measure it where it's been hotter than what it is now. I'm just going to be honest. I haven't gone through and looked and seen what caused that. And I will say there's some uncertainty in that. I mean, at least in its average behavior, it's always been in that window. There may have been brief excursions, too hot or too cold, that just aren't measurable, that I don't have access to.
Talk about the climate. We have to talk about its cycles, because
Well, we do now. We haven't had to in the past because those are a recent
we
thing.
have to now. That's what I'm talking about now. So it turns out that the motion of the sun, the Earth around the sun, and there's 3 components to it.
Right.
Those cycles combine together to make very cold temperatures at times, and then it becomes alleviated, and then we have more
Warmer temperatures. Yeah, right.
And if the cycles had continued over the last, I think it's 50,000 years, it would be very cold now. But the human behavior on Earth kept it more moderate for the last 50,000 years.
Well, so our behavior has extended what normally it goes up, peaks, and you get an ice age. Instead of peaking and driving it into an ice age, it kind of leveled out a little bit, and it's been about 8 to 10,000 years is the time scale. Yeah, the Milankovitch cycles definitely affect things, but I'm even talking a longer scale than the Milankovitch cycles have been around. We've seen this place where we stay in those temperature ranges. So I don't know whether I got to your question or not. Did I get to it?
I think it was kind of similar to what they were talking about. It seems my perception of it seems more of just the natural ebb and flow of the cycle of Earth is that it does cool and heat, and then the human factor is way less than we are giving credit. It seems to be that it's more of just the natural ebbs and flows of the environment.
So what I will say to that is that yes, in terms of the natural variability, we're not talking very much on the human time scale, or on the human scale of it. What is true is that the rate at which it's changed is far faster than it normally does. We have caused that. So what normally happens over thousands of years, we've caused to happen in 100 years. And so that it's a bigger deal than the conservative side tends to say, and it's not as big a deal as the liberal side tends to say. but it's clearly an issue, but it's not a life-threatening issue, I don't think. And so we just need to be careful how we talk about it. And that's, again, my whole point of talking about it theologically, because then if I'm talking to a conservative, my angle is a very different flavor, because I'm talking about, hey, we need to be good stewards because this is what God's called us to. And if we're going to destroy the earth, it's like, well, it seems to be a remarkably well-designed system. Are we really going to just, there are some weird options that come out on both ends, and so let's think theologically well.
Much about, I can see a solution, but we're not headed in that direction for like cutting down carbon emissions, I guess. Have you heard of thorium nuclear reactors?
Mm-hmm.
So they're relatively safe, in your opinion, or not? They're safer than plutonium.
So nuclear reactors, contrary to popular belief, especially in the United States, have been incredibly safe. Our worst disaster had no radiation leakage. I think this is a fairly accurate statement, is that there's something about the United States that seems to be very quickly, the moment you talk about radiation, it's like, oh, something's awful. It's like there's this inordinate fear of it. The reality of it is, you look at what all of the nuclear reactors that worked in the United States, there have been no deaths, I don't even think the people that were working at 3 Mile Island had any problems. Now, that's not true around the world. And the biggest knock against nuclear reactors is not their safety. It's that you end up with all this radioactive waste that you got to figure out what to do with. And there's just no way around that. You got to figure out a way to do with it. I'm inclined to think if we put human creativity to it, we could find a way to use that well. Don't know, haven't thought that much about it, but I'm inclined to, anytime I've bet against human ingenuity, I've likely lost. And so I think there's probably a way to solve that. And that is a way of producing lots of energy reliably, safely, as long as we take it seriously, with very little to no carbon imprint to it. Or I agree. So we're having a fun scientific discussion that we don't have enough background in the literature. I know I don't. But I do know these are the sorts of things people are working towards. And there's a lot of people working towards it, and I think we'll probably get it sorted out. We just, God has orchestrated things and put things in place that we can do what he's called us to do. And again, I'll go back to just theologically what we think about in this. If we underestimate that God has given us stewardship, we're wrong. We're missing. And so we need to take our stewardship seriously. If we underestimate how well-designed things are, we're wrong, because God has organized things well and designed things well. And we need to live in that. That's what God has called us to do. He's designed it well and said, take care of it.
I think an example is plastics. They're like, oh, plastics last all these years and stuff. And then, okay, well, there's this bacteria that eats plastic, and it'll take care of it. And I think there's things out there that we know about that there's kind of a big crisis over it, but there are solutions too for it.
Yeah, I would just say, we got to be careful. So yes, I think there are often solutions, but there are times where we've done things and we have caused global problems and we weren't aware of it. I think the ozone layer is a great example of that. Something where, air conditioning is a great thing. We're enjoying tonight because of it. Used to be what we did with air conditioning would cause problems with the ozone layer. Once we recognized it, we spent the money to fix it. We spent a lot of resources trying to do that too. So it's worth doing that. A lot of the problem with plastics is not the plastics, it's the human behavior. if we actually just threw them away instead of letting them drift out into the oceans and do whatever, there's lots of things we can do to take care of that. And it's human behavior that's the problem, not the actual technology, if you will. Go down to downtown LA, I would disagree. You just go look around at what people do, and one anecdotal example is that when I was growing up, the idea of trash cans just being around on the street was ludicrous because everybody took stuff home and threw it away. Now, the reason why trash cans are around is because they recognize people just throw stuff on the ground. It's just like, well, if they're going to throw it on the ground, well, at least make a trash can. We have become less civilized as a people in that sense. And so it's a people problem, not a material problem. The materials always have, they're neutral. We can either use them well or we can use them poorly. It's a people problem, not a technology problem. Yes?
Kind of goes beyond, different angle, I guess.
All right, let's bring that on.
But listening to everybody's kind of discussions about climate, the way that I'm looking at it too is how it affects our food. And to me, we're living in a time when more and more of our food is less God-made and more man-made.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more push to create that too, because, we don't have as much God-made food, so we're making man-made food. But that also has implications for humanity. But it's also affected by climate and the things we've done to, soil and pesticides and all these other things. So
Yes.
is that, I know that's taking us in a completely different way, but to me that is part of our humanity. And what does affect us is whether or not that is, something of concern, I guess, I see more and more larger companies that are, I guess, trying to make things that are not God-made food, if that makes sense.
I agree.
They're altering things in ways that, like, I don't even think some of what we eat now is even what our grandparents ate. I don't think.
That whole question is a whole lot more complicated than we get at. But what I would, it's a great question. What I would say is there's a scholar that's associated with Reasons to Believe who's done a lot of research into exactly what you're talking about. And one of the things that he's found is, and a talk he gave that I found very fascinating, is that he just went and looked at all the diets that actually work. And he says what's true of every diet that actually works is that they're very heavy on fruits and vegetables and whole foods. And then if you have a diabetes type problem, you might go with Atkins, so you don't have as many carbohydrates. Or, it's like there's these little things, but all of them have a large portion of the diet is fruits and vegetables and whole foods. It's almost like God's designed them well. And there's the studies he's done are just fascinating, because you take a soda, which has so much sugar in it, and you take apple juice, which they tend to have more sugar, but let's say you've got the exact same amount of sugar. You can do studies that show that your body processes this sugar better because it's at least closer to the environment it was in. And so now take that out and put it in an apple, your body just naturally knows how to take care of that. And so as it relates to the climate discussion, one thing that is true is that as the carbon dioxide goes up in the atmosphere, you can grow a lot more food. The problem in feeding people is not a can we grow enough food problem, it's a human problem again. Can we distribute it where it is? Is there corruption? There's a whole slew of human problems associated, but the earth easily grows enough food for everybody. And lo and behold, the more processed the food, the less healthy it is for you. And the less processed it is, the more healthy it is for you. And so it's kind of like God designed things that way. So. I've heard that. I don't know whether that's true or not. It doesn't surprise me, but
Because if you taste a strawberry that's grown
Mm-hmm.
California, they taste totally different. It's totally different.
Yeah.
The wild blueberries are totally different
Mm-hmm.
tasting than the ones that are grown here, and even if they have the organic label, you know. And
I'm gonna stop here, not because this isn't an interesting discussion, just because I don't have enough knowledge to know how to interact with it. And so, rather than have a discussion where we don't know what's going on, I do think if you know to investigate these things, go look at anything Jim Painter has, Painter as in painter, on our website. And he's got a lot of stuff. His resources would actually help address what you're talking about.
no, but I do agree with you, you know, God had a wonderful design, and we need to be responsible stewards of that,
Hmm.
you know.
And our Earth grows a lot of stuff. It's not a food problem. It's a people problem. Seems like we've run out of questions. Appreciate the time here. Hopefully this has been interesting. I've enjoyed the interaction, and it encourages you just to remember, you know, to see the trustworthy and reliableness of God, because creation points that way. And as we live that way, that's a great thing. So we'll turn it back to Josh.
Thank you very much. Okay, next week we have our next scholar, George Harkins. Braxton. I always mess that up. I didn't even attempt your name tonight, so it's worse than Kapczynski. So next week, George Haraxton. He'll be talking about wisdom. So we got a good knowledge dump tonight, right? And so it's we're gonna talk about wisdom next week. And God is wisdom. And so it's a fascinating talk. George is a pastor and a scholar. He used to pastor a new song out in San Diego for years. Now he's on staff at Reasons to Believe. He gave, no offense, Jeff, but he gave, the last talk he gave here was probably my favorite on that whole abortion topic. But the way that the way that he presented that material, which is difficult material, was so graceful. And so I'm really excited to hear him next week on wisdom. I'm sure he's got some great things to say to us. So invite your friends. It's going to be a good talk. And then the next one, I'm not quite sure who we got going on, but it's all on the website. We've got some great scholars lined up. So thanks for coming out, and have a good night. Hope you can stay cool. God bless you guys.